Story 1. Rachel wiped her hands on her jeans, surveying the bathroom she'd been cleaning for hours. The house was old, a fixer-upper she'd bought with the idea of turning it into her dream home. But the more she worked, the more secrets the house seemed to reveal. That's when she noticed it. A thin, jagged crack in the tiles near the base of the wall. At first, she thought it was just wear and tear from the house's age. But as she leaned closer, she saw that the crack wasn't random. It outlined a small rectangular shape, almost like a tiny door. Curiosity prickled at her. She ran her fingers over the edges, feeling the grooves where the tiles didn't quite align. "That's odd," she muttered to herself. She pushed lightly against it, but nothing happened. It was sealed shut. Shrugging it off, she stepped back. Maybe it was just some old structural feature, a relic from the house's past. She decided to leave it alone and returned to cleaning up for the night. Later, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, a faint sound caught her attention. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder the longer she listened. A steady, rhythmic tapping. Rachel sat up, her heart beating faster. It was coming from the bathroom. Rachel crept toward the bathroom, her footsteps soft against the old wooden floors. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was knocking from inside the wall. She turned on the bathroom light, the dim bulb casting long shadows across the tiled floor. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving the room in eerie silence. Her eyes fell on the small crack in the tiles. It looked exactly the same as before, but now it felt different, like it was waiting for her. Rachel knelt beside the crack, running her fingers along the edges again. The cold tile sent a shiver through her fingertips. She pressed against it harder this time, and for a moment she thought she felt it shift, just a fraction of an inch. "Is there something back there?" she murmured to herself, the sound of her own voice strangely comforting in the quiet room. The air grew colder, carrying a faint, earthy scent that hadn't been there before. It reminded her of wet soil, damp and heavy, like a basement that hadn't been opened in years. She grabbed a screwdriver from her toolbox, prying at the edges of the tiles. They gave way slowly, the grout crumbling as the hidden door revealed itself. It was small, barely 2 feet high, with a wooden panel worn and splintered from age. Rachel hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. The door seemed ancient, but there was something about it that made her stomach twist with unease. Taking a deep breath, she pulled on the tiny handle, but it wouldn't open. She tried again, using more force, but the door wouldn't budge. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time, accompanied by something else. Whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. They seemed to come from behind the door, words she couldn't quite make out. As Rachel leaned closer to listen, the door shifted on its own, creaking slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight to peer inside. The beam illuminated a small, dark space, empty except for a single object lying on the ground. A diary. Rachel hesitated, the beam of her flashlight steady on the diary lying in the small, dark space. The air was colder now, biting at her skin as she knelt before the hidden door. Her heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to leave it alone. But curiosity won. She reached in, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed the worn leather cover. Pulling it out, she sat back on her heels and opened the diary. The pages were brittle, the writing faded but still legible. The entries were dated decades ago and started innocently enough, accounts of daily life in the house, the chores, the weather, the mundane. But as she flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting grew shaky, frantic. The writer spoke of noises coming from the walls, scratching, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. Rachel's pulse quickened as she read the final entry. "The door won't stay shut anymore. It's coming for me. If you're reading this, it's already too late." A loud creak shattered the silence. Rachel's head snapped up, her flashlight sweeping the room. The door she had opened was now fully ajar, swinging slightly on its rusted hinges. The tapping returned, louder and more deliberate. But it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was behind her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head, the flashlight beam shaking as it lit up the room. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, indistinct but unmistakable. It didn't move, but she could feel its presence pressing down on her, heavy and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, though she couldn't make out the words. The figure began to shift, its shape bending and twisting unnaturally as it stepped closer. Rachel stumbled backward, clutching the diary to her chest, her flashlight flickering as if the light itself was afraid. Rachel scrambled to her feet, the diary slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her flashlight flickered wildly, the beam barely illuminating the shadowy figure that now stood just a few feet away. Its shape was wrong, shifting and twisting as if it didn't belong in this world. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing in her ears, a cacophony of words she couldn't understand. Rachel bolted for the bathroom door, yanking it open with trembling hands. She stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her. She stood there, panting, her back pressed against the wall as she stared at the closed bathroom door. The whispers had stopped. The house was silent again, the only sound her ragged breathing. Rachel's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her body trembling. She tried to convince herself it was over, that it had been her imagination, but the cold weight in her chest told her otherwise. The next morning, Rachel cautiously returned to the bathroom. The tiles where the hidden door had been were completely intact, the cracks gone as though the door had never existed. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed the entire thing, but when she turned to leave, something caught her eye. Sitting on her nightstand, perfectly placed, was the diary. She hadn't brought it out of the bathroom. Her blood ran cold as she flipped it open. The pages were blank, except for one. In the middle of the book, written in jagged, fresh handwriting, was a single line, "You're next." Rachel's hands trembled as she dropped the diary, and the whispers started again, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere deep within the walls. Story 2. Chris leaned against the kitchen counter, watching as his friends laughed and chatted in the living room. The house felt alive with energy, music playing softly in the background as the party began to wind down. People were gathering their things, saying their goodbyes, and thanking him for hosting. As he made his way to the hallway to tidy up, he noticed the bathroom door was shut. He paused, knocking lightly. "Hey, someone in there?" he called. No one responded. He knocked again, louder this time, and leaned closer to listen. Still nothing. Thinking maybe someone had fallen asleep or passed out, Chris grabbed the doorknob and gave it a twist. To his surprise, it turned easily, and the door creaked open. The bathroom was empty. The sink faucet was running, the steady stream of water echoing softly in the small space. He frowned and stepped inside, turning it off. The air felt damp and cold, more than it should have been. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught something on the floor, a single wet footprint leading out into the hallway. Chris froze, staring at it. He could hear his friends' laughter drifting from the living room, the sound warm and familiar, but this felt wrong. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Probably just someone who forgot to dry their shoes." Still, as he stepped out of the bathroom, he couldn't help but glance down the hallway, his unease growing with each step. As Chris walked back into the living room, he tried to brush off the strange feeling creeping over him. Most of the guests had left, and the few who remained were gathering their things, chatting about their plans for the weekend. The normalcy should have been comforting, but it wasn't. While collecting empty glasses and plates, he noticed something odd. There were more glasses on the table than he remembered anyone using. One of them still had a faint smudge on the rim, as though someone had just taken a sip. He frowned, setting it down and glancing around the room. The laughter in the room suddenly felt quieter, like it was coming from far away. Chris's attention was drawn back to the hallway. The bathroom door, which he was sure he had left open, was now slightly ajar. His chest tightened as he walked toward it, his steps hesitant. The wet footprint was still there, leading from the bathroom into the living room, but there were no other prints, nothing leading in or out of the house. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease as exhaustion from hosting, but when he passed by the hallway mirror, he froze. For a split second, he thought he saw something, a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall. Chris spun around, but the hallway was empty. His heart raced as he turned back to the mirror, staring at his own reflection. It looked normal now, but the faint sense of being watched lingered. The smell of dampness hung in the air, stronger now, and the house felt colder, as if someone had opened a window. He walked back to the living room, grabbing a wet napkin to clean up, but his hand stopped midair when he noticed a chair slightly pulled out from the table. Chris stood there, frozen. No one had sat in that chair all night. Chris's chest tightened as he stared at the pulled-out chair. His friends were busy saying their goodbyes, oblivious to the unease that was now gripping him. He forced a smile, exchanging casual goodbyes as the last guest walked out the door. But the moment the door clicked shut, the house fell into silence. A silence that felt wrong. He turned back to the living room, his eyes scanning the space. Everything seemed normal, until the lights flickered. The sudden dimming and brightening sent a chill down his spine, and he instinctively glanced toward the hallway. There it was. In the mirror at the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure stood, just barely visible. Its form was vague, almost blending into the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. Chris's breathing grew shallow as he took a step closer, squinting to make out the details. The figure moved, not in the mirror, but in the hallway itself. Chris spun around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. A soft tapping sound broke the silence. It was coming from the bathroom. The door creaked open slowly, the sound stretching out like nails on a chalkboard. Chris's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, using the flashlight to pierce the growing shadows. He stepped toward the bathroom, the tapping growing louder. When he reached the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. The mirror above the sink didn't reflect the room. Instead, it showed the living room. In the mirror's image, the shadowy figure stood by the table, its head tilted unnaturally, as though it were staring straight at him. Chris turned to look back at the living room, but it was empty. When he looked at the mirror again, the figure was closer. Its outline blurred and distorted as it reached a long, shadowy hand toward him. Chris stumbled back from the bathroom doorway, his phone shaking in his hand. The tapping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that made his ears ring. His eyes darted between the empty living room and the mirror, where the shadowy figure now stood inches from the glass, its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Who's there?" Chris's voice cracked as he called out, but the room offered no response. Slowly he backed toward the front door, his hand reaching for the knob. When he turned it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked tight, and no amount of pulling or twisting would open it. The figure in the mirror began to move again, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised a hand, pressing it flat against the inside of the mirror. Cracks began to spread from the point of contact, spiderwebbing outward with each second. Chris's breathing grew ragged as the figure leaned closer, its blurred outline sharpening just enough for him to see the faint suggestion of a grin. Panicking, Chris spun around and bolted toward the kitchen, away from the mirrors. The house felt colder now, the damp smell stronger, as if the air itself had turned heavy. He grabbed a chair and placed it against the front door, his hands trembling. But when he turned back to the living room, his stomach dropped. The muddy footprints were back, trailing from the bathroom to where he now stood. They ended right at his feet. His heart pounded as the lights flickered again, plunging the house into darkness. For a moment the silence stretched unbearably. Then he heard it, a voice, low and distorted, whispering from behind him, "Thanks for the invite." Chris turned, but there was nothing there. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty again. Trembling, he backed away toward the front door. When his hand found the knob, it turned easily now, and he stumbled outside into the cold night air. The next day, Chris's friends came by to check on him, worried after not hearing from him. They found the house empty. On the bathroom mirror, written in faint, wet streaks, were the words, "Thanks for the invite." Thanks for the... Story 3. Emma unlocked the door to her apartment, her shoulders heavy with the weight of a long day. The quiet inside was the kind she usually appreciated. But tonight, it felt heavier, almost stifling. She slipped off her shoes and flicked on the lights, illuminating her small, tidy living room. Her gaze swept over the room, and she frowned. The chair by the window was out of place, angled slightly toward the hallway instead of its usual spot facing the coffee table. She paused for a moment, wondering if she'd bumped it on her way out that morning, but she couldn't remember. Shaking her head, she moved the chair back into position. After grabbing a quick snack, Emma headed to her bedroom to change into something more comfortable. As she passed the hallway mirror, she glanced at her reflection, her own tired eyes staring back. Nothing seemed unusual, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Brushing it aside, she changed into her pajamas and got ready for bed. The day had been long, and her body was begging for rest. Just as she was about to turn off the lights, a faint sound made her freeze. It was soft but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Emma stood perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were light and deliberate, like someone moving cautiously across the living room floor. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the hallway as she crept toward the living room. The air felt colder as she stepped in, her pulse quickening. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then she saw it. The chair by the window was turned again, this time facing the hallway. Emma's heart raced as she stared at the chair. It wasn't where she had left it. She was certain of that now. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. "Maybe I bumped it again," she whispered, her voice trembling. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The apartment felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had turned against her. She moved the chair back into place once more, her hands shaking slightly, and backed away into the hallway. The stillness pressed down on her, muffling even the distant hum of traffic outside. As she passed the hallway mirror again, something made her stop. She stared at her reflection, her own eyes wide with unease. The reflection seemed normal at first. But as she turned to keep walking, she thought she saw it linger, just for a moment, as if it hadn't followed her movement immediately. Emma whipped her head back toward the mirror, but everything looked as it should. Her chest tightened, and she rubbed her arms, trying to shake the creeping chill that had settled over her. "You're imagining things," she told herself firmly, though the words sounded hollow. She went into the bathroom, gripping the sink to steady herself. The light above the mirror buzzed faintly, casting a weak glow over the small space. Turning on the faucet, she splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would clear her head. When she glanced up at the mirror again, her stomach dropped. The glass was fogged up, as if someone had been running hot water. But the faucet had only been on cold. Then she saw it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there, a handprint pressed against the fogged surface, as if someone had been leaning into the mirror from the other side. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears. She turned to leave the bathroom, but the lights flickered suddenly, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the handprint was gone. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she stumbled out of the bathroom, her hands gripping the doorframe for support. The hallway seemed darker now, the shadows stretching longer than they should. She glanced toward the living room, hoping to find comfort in the familiarity of her space. But her heart sank. The chair by the window had moved again. This time, it was directly facing her. She swallowed hard, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. A faint sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate tapping. It echoed faintly like fingers drumming on glass. Her head turned toward the hallway mirror, and her blood ran cold. In the reflection she saw herself, but her reflection wasn't moving. It was staring at her, its expression blank and unsettling. Slowly it tilted its head to one side, the movement jerky, almost mechanical. Emma's body stayed frozen, but her reflection lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Emma turned her head to look directly at the mirror, but the reflection was gone. She spun back toward the living room, and there it was. A shadowy figure now stood by the chair, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. It was tall, featureless, and radiated a chilling sense of wrongness. The air seemed to ripple around it as it slowly stepped toward her, each movement deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Emma backed away, her legs trembling as she reached for the front door. The handle wouldn't turn. She pulled harder, panic rising in her chest, but the door was stuck fast. Behind her, the shadow stopped, its head tilting in the same unnatural way her reflection had. The tapping stopped. Silence fell. Then, in a voice that was low and distorted, it whispered, "You're home now." Emma's hands trembled as she yanked at the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadowy figure stood motionless behind her, its head tilted in that unnatural, almost curious angle. The whisper echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. "You're home now?" With a sudden burst of desperation, she turned to face the figure. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice breaking, but the shadow didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the hallway mirror. Emma's stomach twisted as she turned to look. In the mirror's reflection, her apartment appeared empty. No shadow, no chair, no trace of her at all. It was just a blank, lifeless image of her home. But as she stared, her reflection appeared, stepping into view. It wasn't her. Not anymore. The reflection smiled, a slow, chilling grin that stretched too wide. It raised a hand and waved, its head tilting just like the shadow's. Emma stumbled back, her body frozen in place. The shadow behind her began to move, closing the distance between them inch by inch. Suddenly, the apartment lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Emma screamed, clawing at the door, her voice echoing in the silence. When the lights came back on, the apartment was empty. The next morning, Emma's neighbor found her door ajar. The apartment was eerily silent, her belongings untouched. The only thing out of place was the hallway mirror. Etched faintly in the glass, as if written by a finger, were the words, "You're home now." In parentheses,